Think of like the most boring, utterly reliable person in your office.
Right. We all know one.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The one with the perfectly ironed shirts who, they meticulously color code their spreadsheets, they never raise their voice,
Yeah.
and they just seem entirely defined by this totally mundane routine.
Completely predictable.
Right. But now imagine that same person logging off at 5 o'clock, going home, and running a secret underground occult society from their basement.
Sounds like fiction.
It really does.
Yeah.
I mean, you might assume that extreme split personality only exists in movies, but today, as we settle back into the quiet, timeless atmosphere of Café Karma, we're doing a deep dive into ancient texts that claim this exact archetype isn't just a metaphor.
No, it's not.
It's actually a specific, intensely complex psychological profile that is walking among us right now. Our mission today is to map out exactly how that works.
It really is the ultimate paradox of human nature. And there's honestly nowhere better to examine it than right here. Because today, we are looking at the deep earthly manifestation of the 25th Nakshatra, Purva Bhadrapada.
And just to clarify, that's pronounced P-R-B-H-A-A-Drapada.
Exactly. And when we talk about this specific sector of the sky, we are basically forced to look at the things we do not say. The faces we never show to the public.
The hidden stuff.
Right. The raw, untamed forces that we try so desperately to keep locked away behind a polite, socially acceptable smile.
Which is heavy. I mean, the text we are pulling from today actually describe this profile as the dual-faced transformer.
Yes.
It's this profound Jekyll and Hyde existence. But before we get into how this actually manifests in the real world, we really need to understand the mechanism behind it. Because the sources talk about an internal fire dragon called Aja Ekapada.
Yeah, Aja Ekapada.
And I want to be careful here because, calling it a literal fire dragon makes it sound like a fantasy novel. Yeah. It kind of diminishes how heavy this actually is.
That is a really crucial distinction to make because when the ancient texts use the imagery of Aja Ekapada, the ancient fire dragon, they are absolutely not talking about a mythological beast.
Right.
They are describing a psychological reality. The dragon represents raw, destructive, unfiltered human passion. It is the primordial heat of absolute truth.
Like the taboo stuff.
Exactly. The intense taboos, the radical ideologies, basically the things a human being would do if laws, morals, and social norms just completely cease to exist.
Wow.
Yeah, it is this ecstatic, destructive fire that just wants to burn away all illusions.
But I mean, no one can just walk around in modern society acting on their deepest, most destructive impulses. You would be locked up or just completely isolated from everyone.
Which brings us to the ruling planet of this star, which is Jupiter.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So Jupiter is the cosmic force of ethics, expansiveness, societal norms, and polite philosophy. So you have a native who is essentially using the heavy, civilized rules of Jupiter as a cage to domesticate their internal chaotic fire.
They're trapping it.
Exactly. The inner intensity is so overwhelming, so destructive to the mundane world that wearing a flawless societal mask is not just a preference, it is an absolute survival tactic.
So the spreadsheets, the iron shirts, the small talk at the water cooler, that is the Jupiter mask.
Yes.
It's an incredibly heavy pressure cooker. And that makes me wonder how this pressure cooker shapes a person's actual life trajectory. Like, for instance, if we look at the ascendant or the Lanya.
Physical vehicle.
Right, the physical vehicle moving through the world. If someone's ascendant falls in Purva Bhadrapada, what does that vehicle look like?
Well, when this energy hijacks the ascendant, the physical vehicle itself becomes highly strung. I mean, these individuals are intensely philosophical, but they appear nervous.
Like they're vibrating.
Yeah, almost humming with a barely contained current. Because the inner fire is constantly threatening to burn through the mask, they become incredibly restless. They experience frequent, sudden changes of residence. It is almost as if they are trying to physically outrun their own internal intensity by, constantly changing their external environment.
So they're literally packing up the apartment the second the walls start feeling too hot.
That is the exact mechanism. And, on an interpersonal level, this placement generates very extreme, often turbulent sexual attractions.
Because the energy needs somewhere to go.
Right. The raw energy of Aja Ekapada demands an outlet. And when it cannot be expressed in polite society, it often channels violently into their private relationships.
That makes perfect sense for the outer shell. But, what if we go deeper? What if this star sits where the moon is placed in their birth chart?
The emotional landscape.
Yeah, because the moon represents the internal mind. And the texts note that a Purva Bhadrapada moon native is highly scholarly, deeply intuitive, but plagued by a brooding internal torment.
You're very brooding.
But there is a specific detail here that just fascinated me. The sources say they are notoriously stingy with money.
Yes, very tight-fisted.
And I am struggling to connect those dots. Like, why does harboring an internal fire dragon make someone hoard their cash?
Well, look at the psychology of the mask. If you view the external world as a rigid, volatile place where one slip up could expose your darkest, most vulnerable truths, you need walls.
Oh, yeah.
For these natives, material wealth is not about luxury. It's about building a fortress. Money is a defense mechanism.
That makes so much sense.
Right. They hoard their resources because financial independence means they don't have to rely on a society they secretly feel entirely detached from.
It's the ultimate leave me alone fun.
Exactly.
But wait, the sources also mention a massive contradiction to this.
They do.
They are penny pinchers with the world, but they will take that entire fortress of wealth and place it completely at the disposal of their spouse, their partner, or like a single cause they passionately believe in.
Because giving someone your resources is the ultimate act of letting them behind the mask.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all or nothing. To the world, they offer nothing but the facade. But if a partner proves they can look at the inner fire and not run away, the native surrenders everything to them. It is a profound, desperate kind of trust.
That is incredibly heavy. And it contrasts completely with what happens if the sun is placed in this star. Because the sun dictates the core ego, right? The soul's purpose.
Right.
If the ego is driven by this need to hide the shadow, the sources say these individuals are blessed with immense creative intelligence, but they harbor an agonizing, profound need for seclusion.
Well, the ego requires validation, but for someone born under this influence, any validation they receive from the public feels hollow.
Because they know the public is only applauding the mask.
Exactly. The mask is getting the applause, not them.
Yeah.
And this creates a deep moodiness. They require long periods of total, uncompromising isolation simply to put the mask down.
To recharge.
Yeah, they literally need to sit in a dark room by themselves just to breathe, to exist without the exhaustion of pretending to be normal.
Okay, let's unpack this structure a bit more. Because if everyone born under this constellation is carrying this intense, dual-natured shadow, they can't possibly all manifest it the exact same way.
No, absolutely not.
The mask has to look different depending on the person. And the texts break this down into 4 padas, or quarters.
Right. And to understand the padas, you really have to look at the concept of a navamsa.
Right, the subdivisions.
Yeah. If a star sign is the overarching theme, the navamsa is like a microscopic sublayer. It's the underlying genetic code of that specific degree of the sky.
Okay.
So the 25th nakshatra is divided into 4 of these microscopic flavors, and each one refracts the dragon's fire in a radically different direction.
Well, let's walk through those flavors. So the first pada falls in the Aries Navamsa, which is ruled by Mars. Mars is the warrior, right? The planet of action.
Yes, pure action.
So here, the shadow isn't just brooding in a dark room.
Far from it. In the first pada, the fire is directed outward as pure mental determination and aggressive willpower.
Okay, so it's active.
Very. This is the individual who channels their intense, radical inner beliefs into a specific objective. They might still wear a polite mask, but their actions are sharply focused on forcing change or achieving dominance in their chosen field. The shadow basically becomes a weapon.
Which is a sharp pivot from the second pada, because this one falls in Taurus, ruled by Venus, and Venus is luxury, aesthetics, the physical world.
The physical senses, yes.
The sources actually call this the indulgent quarter. So if the first pada is the warrior, the second pada seems to be like the hedonist.
That's exactly it. The internal pressure here seeks relief through the physical senses. Because the dark side of human nature isn't just about destruction, right? It is often about excessive consumption.
Numbing it out.
Exactly. This native uses earthly pleasures, whether that is food, intimacy, or material indulgence, to soothe the internal fire. The shadow manifests as a secret life of profound, sometimes reckless escapism into the material world.
Fascinating. And then we shift into the third pada, which falls in Gemini, ruled by Mercury. This is the communicative, curious quarter.
The intellectual quarter.
Yeah, and the texts consider it the lightest of the 4, which is interesting. Have you ever found yourself wide awake at 2 a.m., absolutely doomed, scrolling through a Wikipedia rabbit hole about obscure historical tragedies or unsolved mysteries?
Oh, absolutely.
That is exactly what this panda reminds me of.
It is a perfect modern translation of this energy. Mercury is the planet of intellect and communication. So rather than acting aggressively or indulging physically, this native explores their dark side analytically.
Oh, so they study it.
Yes. They are fascinated by the macabre, the taboo, the hidden mechanics of the universe. But they engage with it through writing, researching, or intellectual curiosity. They want to dissect the shadow, not necessarily live it out.
And that analytical approach brings us to the fourth panda. And this is where I really need us to pause, because the texts throw a massive curveball here.
They do.
This final quarter falls in Cancer, which is ruled by the moon. And the ancient sources explicitly label this the diabolical or extremely dangerous quarter. But wait, Cancer is the universal archetype of the mother. It represents nurturing, caretaking, empathy. How does a maternal, sensitive influence create the most lethal psychological profile on this list?
Well, you have to look at the core mission of this nakshatra, which is hiding a destructive inner truth from the world.
Right.
If you want to conceal something unpredictable, extreme, and genuinely dangerous, you do not dress it up as a warrior or a brooding philosopher. The most effective camouflage in the wild is the one that looks entirely harmless.
Oh, man. So it's the wolf in sheep's clothing.
Even more sophisticated than that, it is the anglerfish.
Oh, the anglerfish.
Yeah, the nurturing maternal aspect of Cancer becomes the ultimate societal shield. Because this native appears incredibly benign, deeply supportive, and unconditionally caring, society hands them the keys to everything.
Because everyone trusts them.
Exactly. Absolutely no one suspects the intense, potentially destructive capability lurking underneath that warm exterior. It allows them to navigate the world with zero friction and zero suspicion.
That is wild.
If they love you, they are profoundly, fiercely protective. But if provoked, they are capable of lethally deceptive maneuvering. You simply never see the strike coming because you were too busy looking at the smile.
That is chilling. I mean, it really is the perfect hiding spot. And, it makes me think about where these people end up in society.
Professionally, you mean?
Yeah. If you are a soul naturally built to navigate darkness, and you are wearing this flawless, socially acceptable mask that has to dictate how you spend your waking hours, where do these individuals gravitate?
They naturally seek out the thresholds. Careers that deal intimately with the literal or metaphorical boundaries of life, death, and transition. They are drawn to the edge of the abyss where the mask is actually useful.
Which lines up with the sources, because they list some incredibly intense, specific professions here. Morticians, cemetery keepers, surgeons, people who are quite literally standing on the border of life and death every single day, managing the physical reality of the end.
Right, because it requires a certain psychological detachment to do those jobs, a detachment this nakshatra naturally provides.
Yeah.
But it also extends beyond physical death.
Like where else?
You find these natives deeply entrenched in roles that deal with the unseen, the extreme, or the toxic. They are the occultists, the black magicians, or people working in heavy, highly dangerous industrial environments.
Oh, that makes sense.
And they are also the mystery and science fiction writers who meticulously construct terrifying explorations of the human imagination.
The outline also mentions radical activists.
Yeah.
And I want to be very clear to you listening. The astrological texts frame this completely independently of any modern political ideology, right or left.
Yes.
It's not about a specific political party. It is about the underlying energy. It is the purest expression of that unyielding drive to completely tear down a societal structure they believe is false, just to see what grows in the ashes.
Exactly. The ideology itself is entirely secondary to the impulse. The impulse is Aja Ekapada. It is applying the heat of truth to a rotting structure and forcing a transition. It is revolutionary energy in its rawest, most apolitical form.
It is funny in a very dry, dark way. Because if you are going to dedicate your entire life to plotting radical societal collapse, or studying ancient black magic, or writing terrifying horror novels, you still have to pay your internet bill.
True.
It really pays to have that steady, boring corporate job to fund the revolution.
The ancient texts actually acknowledge that friction, believe it or not.
Oh, really?
Yes. The earthly plane requires capital. The mask is not merely a psychological defense mechanism, it is an economic necessity.
Wow.
The universe demands that we pay rent, buy groceries, and maintain a credit score, even while we are quietly tending to our inner chaos. The 9 to 5 is literally what subsidizes the shadow.
Which brings us to the physical reality of maintaining that setup. Because holding that much tension inside a biological vessel, it just isn't sustainable.
No, it's not.
Carrying that intense, destructive passion while working a high-stress job and maintaining a fake, polite smile for society that has to cause massive wear and tear on the human body.
And the medical astrology of Purva Bhadrapada maps out this exact toll. Physically, this constellation governs the sides of the body, the ribs, the left thigh, and the soles of the feet.
Okay.
When the psychological pressure builds up, these are the areas that crack first.
Because the texts specifically mention a vulnerability to swollen ankles, severe issues with poor blood circulation, and an enlarged liver. So let's break down the mechanics of why that happens.
To understand the physical breakdown, we really have to look at the Ayurvedic humors, the biological energies associated with this star. It is a clash of two very volatile elements.
Okay, what are they?
You have Pitta, which is fire, driven by the intense passion of the deity Aja Ekapada, and you have Vata, which is air, driven by the overarching planetary forces and the air sign of Aquarius, where the bulk of this nakshatra resides.
So you are basically pumping raw air directly into intense fire.
Exactly. And when you mix concentrated air with fire inside a closed system like the human body, you do not just get a warm, comforting glow, you get a blowtorch effect.
A blowtorch. Ouch.
Yes. The nervous system, which is ruled by Vata, acts like a bellows. It's constantly feeding oxygen to the pit of fire of their hidden passions. It creates an intensely pressurized, concentrated heat that the body has to somehow contain.
It makes me think of an electrical system in a house. Imagine you have standard, everyday copper wiring, that is the normal human body.
Right.
But plugged into it is this massive industrial high-voltage machine pulling thousands of watts. Over time, those standard wires just cannot handle that kind of current. The insulation melts.
To fail.
Yeah, the wires start to fray and short out. That perfectly explains the circulation dropping.
Hey.
The blood literally struggles to move through a frayed system.
The fraying wire is an incredibly accurate analogy. Just look at the specific organs affected. The liver is the body's primary filter, right? It is designed to process and expel toxin.
Right.
But under the constant systemic stress of holding back so much psychological and emotional toxicity, the liver becomes overwhelmed and physically enlarges.
Wow.
And the swelling of the ankles and the soles of the feet, it's symbolic as much as it is physical.
How so?
The feet represent our grounding, our connection to the earth. When the internal blowtorch is running too hot, the foundation itself starts to swell and crack. The biological hardware simply burns out under the immense pressure of the software.
Unbelievable. So after laying all of this out, the masks, the hidden agendas, the psychological pressure cookers, and the fraying wires, what does this actually mean for you, the person listening to this right now?
That's the real question.
Because odds are you weren't born under this exact specific star configuration. But there is something deeply, uncomfortably universal about everything we just discussed.
Well, the value of studying a nakshatra like Purva Bhadrapada is that it acts as a magnifying glass for the human experience. We all possess a psychological shadow.
Every single one of us.
Yes. Every one of us has an inner reservoir of intense passions, strange, irrational curiosities, or radical, unfiltered truths that polite society asks us to swallow. We all learn, to some degree, to wear the Jupiter mask.
Right.
This star simply teaches us the anatomy of that shadow. It forces us to look at the severe biological and psychological toll it takes to divide ourselves into two different people.
It is incredibly heavy when you realize how much energy we waste just trying to appear normal.
It is exhausting.
Ah.
But according to the philosophy of this nakshatra, it is also a deeply necessary stage of human evolution, because the ultimate core existential purpose of Purva Bhadrapada is not merely to suffer through this duality until you die.
So what is it?
The core purpose is transforming the self through the fires of truth.
Transforming the self through the fires of truth.
Yes, the friction, the pain, the blowtorch effect, it is all designed to eventually burn away the ego. It burns away the false mask entirely, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of the soul. It is the necessary, agonizing destruction that has to happen before we can reach any kind of ultimate liberation or peace.
Well, as we fit here, letting the quiet of Café Karma settle around us and wrapping up this deep dive into the shadow, I want to leave you with something to ponder as you transition back into your day. Think about the mask you are wearing right now.
We all have one.
That highly functional, polite, reasonable exterior you present to your boss, your neighbors, maybe even your closest family members. What part of your own shadow are you keeping perfectly hidden behind that spreadsheet at your 9 to 5? And more importantly, what truth is it secretly trying to burn through